Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Susanna McIntyre, and I'm the Development Associate and at the AHA Foundation, as well as the Interim Coordinator for the Clarity Coalition. And we are here to do the webinar number 3 of our series, Recapturing Liberalism in Education. This series was really born out of a growing concern regarding the ideological transformations that are reshaping not only our schools, but undermining the liberal values that are the foundation of open inquiry, as well as individual rights. But in some cases, this ideological capture is doing even more. It is openly fostering a hostility towards Jews and Israelis, quite openly at this point. So today's webinar, titled Antisemitism in K-12 Education, a Warning Sign for Society, takes a step back to explore how anti-Semitism has evolved within educational spaces, how identity-based narratives and critical frameworks have enabled this, and how anti-Israel sentiment is increasingly embedded into K-12 instruction, even across subjects that have no natural connection to any Middle East subject matter. And today, to help us unpack this, we are fortunate to be joined by 2 amazing people who have written extensively on these issues. We have Dr. Naya Lekht, who is a scholar of research and education, whose work has focused on anti-Semitism, Jewish identity, as well as the intersection of ideology and pedagogy. She is a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, known as ISGAP for short, and a frequent lecturer on the Soviet roots of contemporary anti-Semitism. Dr. Lekht brings a unique lens to understanding how anti-Semitic narratives have gained traction in the modern day. Now, we also have David Bernstein, who is the founder and CEO of the North American Values Institute, previously known as the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and the author of Woke Antisemitism, How Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. Highly recommend. It's a good read. And with decades of experience in Jewish advocacy, Bernstein now leads NAVI's work countering illiberal ideologies with a primary focus on K-12 education. So the format of today's webinar is we're going to begin with a moderated discussion, and it'll be followed by a Q&A with your questions. So I invite everyone to engage, and if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat below, and we will answer them as we are able. And thank you all for being here, and with that, we can get started. So I know this is a big question to launch into, but we have to start somewhere, which is, what does anti-Semitism look like today in K-12 education? And how has that changed from how it may have looked either, within your early lifetimes or even a few years ago?
Okay, so I hope it's okay if I begin. I want to thank you so much first for having both myself and David Bernstein on this really important topic. Look, I want to say one very important comment to kind of frame our discussion, and that is that I think that anti-Semitism in both higher education and K-12 is not an October 7th story. And I've been seeing ever since October 7th a incorrect diagnosis of this problem as a post-October 7th moment. So I want to begin by saying this is not an October 7th story, that the anti-Semitism that has been unfolding in higher education and then trickled into K-12 is at least 25 years in the making. To answer, though, your question, how does it look and how does it look different from when I was growing up, per se? I will say that the anti-Semitism is being bolstered by a framework which I feel that I have at least some sense of understanding since I devoted time to studying the Soviet Union and the history of Marxism. The problem with this anti-Semitism is that it wasn't the anti-Semitism that first was manifest. Rather, it was that these certain ideologies that come from Marxist framing of, and you've heard this, many people on this call perhaps even have this idea of bifurcating the world versus oppressor versus oppressed. That provided fertile ground for this new anti-Semitism. Now, we call it new, but of course, it's not really new because it really emerged in the late 1960s and 70s in the Soviet Union. But for the American Jewry, it was new. And it really dates back to the early 2000s with the kind of combination of three world events, 9/11, Second Intifada, and the Durban Conference in South Africa. These three events kind of provided fertile ground for this Marxist narrative, which was already kind of dominant within the humanities in academia. But it really, to use the language of the left, allowed those activists who wanted to, quote unquote, center Palestine to do so, and gave free kind of real estate space in academia to center that Palestine narrative. And so what, at least and I'm sharing from my understanding of both being an undergraduate student in the early 2000s and then in graduate school, seeing this anti-Semitism unfold. Now, it didn't look like swastikas. It didn't look like white supremacy. It didn't look like anti-Semitism from the right. Rather, it looked very much from what I just said, which was the Soviet era anti-Zionism, which came to college campuses. And maybe we could speak about this later, but one thing that I early on identified was American Jewish community was not equipped to deal with it. And so I returned to my, first brief remarks in that many Jews today, many Jews working who call themselves in the Jewish professional space, who are saying this is an October 7th moment, are again misdiagnosing this problem of anti-Semitism, which is not really didn't proliferate after October 7th. It's been building up, and it's been building up because this Marxist framework has given fertile ground for the anti-Semitism on the left to really kind of center itself. So I just want to leave those remarks, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on this panel with Naya, who's a real expert in these ideologies. And I also really appreciate sort of discussing and fleshing out the intersection between Soviet era anti-Semitism and what we're seeing now. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio in the 1980s, mostly 1970s, 1980s. So I've got a few years on Naya. And I remember experiencing a lot of anti-Semitism, particularly in my early years in high school. There were a lot of coins thrown at my feet. There were swastikas in my books, usually with a, joke, but, it wasn't really that funny. And it was constant and it was incessant. And that's what I understood anti-Semitism to be. When I got to college, and this is, late 1980s and the like, well, actually 1985, 1986, and then in graduate school in the late 80s, early 90s, I started to see the antecedents of what we're experiencing today. I remember, and it wasn't just an anti-Semitism. I think it goes back to your original framing, Susanna, around this sort of oppressor-oppressed ideology and what illiberalism that was seeping in. I remember taking a women's studies class in college because I was interested, and I had come across some radical feminist literature that I thought would be interesting to discuss. And I was a philosophy major, and in philosophy class, everything was open for debate. That's what it was. It was a way to sort of flesh out one's critical thinking skills. And I remember going to the class and raising a critical voice about what the professor was saying, and I was immediately shut down because she had a framework she was operating under. This was not the liberal framework. It was not a way of having conversations about competing theories. It was not a way to discuss and diagnose the world. She had a diagnosis, and our job was to look at different iterations of the same fundamental diagnosis. And that was it. And so I learned the hard way that there was a new ideology setting in. I also experienced it more in the form of contemporary anti-Semitism when Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture, he was a Black nationalist leader in the 60s, who was still on the scene even in the late 1980s, came to my campus, and I went to hear him speak. And he said at this meeting, the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. And everybody knew I was Jewish and in the room, and I thought that wasn't good. Now, nothing happened to me, but I realized that Zionism wasn't just about having coins. Anti-Semitism wasn't just about having coins thrown at your shoes. I started to see this as I entered the Jewish world, the Jewish professional world, in the early 1990s and the like. I started to see this more and more. I wrote a memo to my colleagues at this organization that I worked at called the American Jewish Committee. It's one of the large legacy organizations, that I was going to civil rights spaces, and I was hearing a very different narrative about America. And that narrative went from America is an imperfect country trying to live up to its high ideals, but sometimes falling short, to America is this pervasively white supremacist country and systemically racist. And I didn't know that I knew the term systemically racist 25 years ago, but in March 2001, I found my memo in this drawer, and I don't keep anything, but I found the memo in this drawer that I had written my colleagues saying, I'm really concerned about what I'm hearing. And we've got to be able to respond to this. And it caused a bit of a ruckus within the organization, because there were people even then who thought we had to reconcile themselves to whatever trend was happening in their own ideological backyard. So I saw it again in 2013, 2014. I headed up a pro-Israel campus organization called the David Project. And we were trying to get elites on college campus to understand the complexity of the situation. And so we would bring them to Israel, and they would grapple with the manifest dilemmas Israelis are facing, warts and all, as we used to say. And then in 2013, 2014, something started to change. I couldn't really put my finger on it. Some of the same students that we had been cultivating, that we brought to Israel, were now in this very different mindset. It felt much more hostile and critical. And I realized that that later on, actually, when I went back to sort of interpret the moment, that the Ferguson, protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, and then the onset of new social media like Tumblr, had really reprogrammed the minds of many students, and really rapidly. And I started a new job as CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs in 2016. This was an umbrella of the local Jewish community relations and advocacy community. And my first article on the first day was about intersectionality. And I said, look, somehow these organizations are starting to connect their causes. So the Palestinian Solidarity Movement is being connected to the anti-women, women's sex violence movement, to the environmental movement and the like. And this is a problem for us. It's based on this very stark ideology. And there was an eruption of anger at me for writing that piece. And there was something like 9 op-eds written in response. So you can imagine my first week on the job didn't go as I planned. And so, again, I've been attuned to what Naya is saying. This is not an October 7th problem. In fact, my book, Woke Antisemitism, you don't have to buy it, but anyway, in case you're interested, Woke Antisemitism was written a full year before October 7th. And it was about exactly what happened on October 8th to the American Jewish community, and exactly what we've seen in K-12 education well before October 7th ever happened. It was brewing. It was brewing because this ideology had set in, and it caught on, especially after October 7th, because our adversaries and the ideologues saw an opportunity to spread it. So I'll stop there.
That's actually a great segue into one of the questions I had prepared, which is basically, I would love to unpack for our audience in more specificity how social justice or critical frameworks are used to amplify, or how anti-Semites exploit them for their own ideological purposes. Because a lot of people might kind of hear this and like, oh, how progressive ideologies harms Jews, like what does that mean? But there is actually a systematic way in which this framework leads to that conclusion that I'd like to unpack for everyone before we move specifically into K-12 space.
That's a great question. To begin answering it, I want to take a few steps back and say that anti-Semitism is a very unique type of hatred for various reasons. But this morning, I was reading an essay on anti-Semitism, and the writer used a very interesting line, and he said, anti-Semitism is hatred, moralized. In essence, for the anti-Semite, the hatred towards the Jew is very righteous. It's a righteous cause. The anti-Semite does not wake up in the morning and think of themselves as filled with hate. No, the anti-Semite wakes up in the morning and thinks of ways of bettering the world. This is not just it's not just a social justice phenomenon. It's been this way. And so it's very difficult to treat it because it has a moral component. Now, it's of course immoral, but for the person who has cast all the sins of the world onto the Jew, they believe that they are rescuing the world. Now, why do I say this? Because, as you said, how is it that anti-Semitism has nestled its way into the social justice movement? Well, if you understand that the nature of anti-Semitism is such that the Jew is cast as a villain always, right? In the three major eras of Jew hatred, which is Judeophobia or anti-Judaism, to anti-Semitism, to now anti-Zionism, the Jew is always cast as this mega villain. And the Jew always violates the tenets that that society deems to be morally, pure. So during anti-Judaism, the Jew was a villain because he violated the tenets of Christianity. Then during anti-Semitism, the tenets of, a purity of race or Bolshevism or capitalism, whatever. And today in anti-Zionism, what do we care most about? Human rights. And so the Jew vis-a-vis Israel and Zionism is, his sin is located in the fact that he's violating human rights. And that is where social justice is located. Now, how did it get into universities and higher education? Well, I want to call everybody's attention to a very important study that came out in the year 2015 by an organization known as the Amcha Initiative, which I think everyone should really familiarize themselves with. In 2015, Amcha Initiative published a study looking at higher education, but they asked a very interesting question. Not only which professors or scholars support BDS, which is the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement, but they asked a kind of follow-up question, which is which disciplines in higher education share an interest or have an interest in supporting the Palestinian cause, or rather supporting the anti-Israel cause. And what they found is that in the year 2015, 48% of faculty in the humanities have a huge proclivity for support for BDS. Moreover, they started kind of like digging, and they found that kind of the biggest miscreant, if you will, of who supports BDS is English faculty in the English department. Now, you would think, now I studied literature, my PhD is in Russian literature. We did formalism, structuralism. Yes, there was Marxism, there was feminist criticism. But what they found, interestingly enough, is that in the English department as a discipline, there were 4 areas of research that kind of kept a pattern that emerged. And they were race, gender, empire, and class. Now, it means that in the year at least 2015, those faculty who supported the Boycott, Divestment, Sanction movement, which is an anti-Semitic movement, their research interests seem to show, again, this proclivity towards analyzing the world through power dynamics and power structures. And that is where this kind of anti-Semitism that sees itself as a cause, as a righteous cause, right, found its way really it nestled itself into these causes that wanted to, quote unquote, better the world. These English professors, the discipline itself, I mean, you would think actually, who would be interested in studying the Middle East? It would probably be, international scholars of international affairs, Middle East scholars, but no. In the year 2015, it was the English department, because they coalesced around these 4 subcategories of research, which showed, again, this tendency to look at the world through the lens of, again, power dynamics, power privilege. And that is where anti-Semitism found absolute fertile ground in that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to take off where Naya left off, which is, so you take that ideological context and you introduce sort of radical Muslim activism, particularly on US college campuses. And you start to bring in also groups on the US scene who come in, who are trying to influence American public opinion, who have known associations with the Muslim Brotherhood movement and the like. And they start to position themselves within this ideological framework, knowing that it's susceptible to influence. I don't know, do I have the ability to share my screen?
You should.
I do. I do. Okay, I'm going to share something from last night. Okay, so just don't think this is like old material that I've prepped. But this is this was I saw this come through the transom last night. It's about there's an activist who Muslim radical activist who put this out. I don't steal as someone else well. It's about it's a clear anti-Semitic stereotype of a Jewish person that they superimposed a Jewish star on, and raising obvious anti-Semitic tropes, right? So who, I started, okay, who is this person? Learn a little bit about him, start to look at his Instagram feed and his various social media channels. And let me see if I can find it. 1 second. I'm gonna have to tee it up again. And of course, what I found in all that was someone who had really delved into and understood the various ideological dynamics that I'm going to give that Naya just spoke about. So this is a guy named Wafik Faor. And this is him commenting about this is how collective liberation works. When ICE attacks and arrests our migrant neighbors, when police shoot our Black and brown people, when the American system discriminates against us, we must unite and take to the streets. Now, I have my doubts about whether Wafik is a serious proponent of racial justice ideology. But what Wafik certainly knows is that ideology is the perfect way in for his radical teachings about Israel and the Palestinian situation. And he's able to use that to get in. Now, why couldn't we do the same? And I have to tell you, I spent years trying to do exactly what he's doing. In other words, I said, okay, look, I can't control what the discourse looks like. It's set by larger forces than me. And I just got to work with it. So I would train Jews who are fighting against these radical tendencies to use the right talking points, to go in and say, yes, of course we agree with this larger framework, and we're here, we're the ones who we're also oppressed and the like. And what I realized at a certain point was A, it wasn't working, and B, it was wrong. Now, why wasn't it working? It wasn't working because Jews are perceived as a privileged group, and because privilege, the very idea of privilege, is conflated with economic success in this ideology. The only way you can be a quote unquote successful group is because you were part of the white power structure and you took advantage of the white power structure and you passed. Okay, so it wasn't working. And B, it was wrong because in doing that, I was just reinforcing that very ideological framework that was undermining me as a Jew, but also the larger society. So I realized, and I stopped doing that. And what I realized, but the other side knows how to play the game. And it's amazing to see, and you really saw this after October 7th take off. That's why on October 9th, 31 student groups at Harvard were able to issue a statement blaming Israel for the massacre that was just committed against Israeli citizens before a single bomb had dropped in Gaza. They were able to do that because they had been so primed with that ideology and were able to sort of fit this radical Islamic view, the Hamas view. Now, it doesn't mean that every student on campus buys into the entirety of the narrative, but they don't have to. When you have the radicals come up and they claim leadership of these movements, and they say, you must defer to me because I'm the oppressed person. That's part of this ideology we should talk about. It's not just a claim of oppression. It's a claim of oppression plus a claim to having special knowledge of oppression itself because of their lived experience. And so a person who's been swimming in the waters of illiberal ideology and being told that only the marginalized person gets to define reality for everyone else, if that's what they've been told and that's what they've come to believe, then when a radical Muslim leader comes up on campus and says, I'm the oppressed, I'm the brown person here, you must defer to me, they're going to defer to them, even if they have some questions about how far they're going. And that's the dynamic I think we've seen on college campuses today, and it's jumped the lab into K-12 education as well.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking about is very appreciated, because a lot of people have clearly identified that what we've seen on campuses since October 7th is not merely a function of what's been going on in academia. They've identified, no, this is happening because young adults were primed to adopt this very quickly because of what they've already been experiencing and taught in K-12 education for some time. So I'd be interested to hear about, your opinion that some people in response to that feel that education on anti-Semitism should be mandated within the K-12 space. This often takes the form of Holocaust education, but that in and of itself is a little bit of a tricky subject that has, a real, cost benefit analysis that needs to be occurred based on our history of how those educational efforts have gone. So I know that's a lot to unpack, but we've talked about this a little bit before the webinar. Please tell us about your opinions on mandating this kind of education for young children or young adults, and in what form should it take?
Can I start with that one, Naya, for a second?
Sure.
I want to say something about Holocaust education. Look, I'm a Jewish person, and while I didn't have family who died in the Holocaust, it dominates my entire worldview, like the idea of evil and what it can mean. And, so I want the world to understand the Holocaust. And so I've always been someone who supported Holocaust education, even though I thought it might be taking up a lot of space in the Jewish community. I still thought it was absolutely incumbent that we teach the next generation about the Holocaust. But what I learned, just because there's been studying it for many years, is while Holocaust education may be important, it was not immunizing our society against anti-Semitism. In some cases, you could even argue it might have been fanning the flames. I don't want to blame Holocaust education on anti-Semitism, but there's no evidence that it was working in that sense. People were conditioned to seeing Jews as weak. So if you were an anti-Semite and you looked at the world that way, this just gave you more fodder in some ways. And I think that's of concern. Also, what we saw is that this sort of universalization of the Holocaust as well. So in other words, it was no longer about the Holocaust itself as a unique event, an unprecedented event in history, but rather it was an event that was supposed to tell us about every supposed genocide everywhere. Now, you don't want to render the Holocaust so unique that it has no lessons for the world, as the great philosopher Emil Fackenheim taught us many years ago. But you also don't want to generalize it so much as that it seeks to have its own, tell its own story. But I want to go to the other question about anti-Semitism education. Look, I think it's important people learn about anti-Semitism. What can I tell you, right? But what I do worry about is that when generally it's taught in a way that just sort of emphasizes anti-Semitism on the right, and that the kind of anti-Semitism that's really infecting K-12 institutions and universities is papered over if addressed at all. So if I knew Naya was leading these programs because she knows the ideological currents and can teach it that way, I'd be okay with it. Unfortunately, that's not how it's being done in a lot of places. And so I'm tempted to say, well, let's just try to get Naya's approach to anti-Semitism in there. But I worry that it's being slotted into a DEI framework in the larger sense. And it's reinforcing that larger DEI framework, and that by sort of agreeing to the anti-Semitism curriculum, what you're really doing is agreeing to the larger DEI framework that just causes the problem in the first place. So I'm very skeptical of it. And maybe certain contexts, if you told me the specific context, if I knew it was a school system that was intellectually open, that hadn't bought in, completely to radical DEI pedagogies and wasn't just trying to slot it in, I might be okay with it, but that's not the case in a lot of schools that I've encountered.
Okay, so David, this is great. You provided me exactly kind of the necessary steps that I would love to say. I want to just first say that in reflecting on the necessity and efficacy of mandating anti-Semitism education or education on anti-Semitism, I think I've evolved, because if you had asked me in the year 2019, I was very much for mandating training, and I even used the word training on anti-Semitism. And I'll tell you why I have evolved. And in order to tell you this, I want to share a story, but in order to share the story, I'm going to protect the identity of certain people and names of schools. I do work with different schools, but non-Jewish schools, okay? So after October 7th, there was an identifiable surge in K-12 anti-Semitism in independent schools, private schools, in elite private schools, okay? And Jewish parents felt that they needed to form affinity groups. And they knocked on the doors of the heads of schools and said, we demand that there be training on anti-Semitism because it's getting out of hand. And heads of schools decided to bring in certain Jewish organizations to do training on anti-Semitism. Well, a year later, the following happened. A year later, a new group of parents started knocking on the door and saying that this training on anti-Semitism is offensive and Islamophobic, and that now we demand training on Islamophobia, and now we demand training on the Palestinian experience. And what the individual shared that with me, conversation kind of proved to me, was that the problem with this anti-Semitism education and how I've identified it is that it's rights-based versus truth-based. Now, what do I mean by that? What do I mean by that is that in order to kind of prevent and address these Jewish parents and say the rights of our Jewish students is being trampled on, we need our voices heard, our Jewish lived experience. We need to be included, as David says, in the DEI framework. Where are the Jewish voices? Include us. And so the schools reacted and decided to bring in training on anti-Semitism. But if you looked at the type of training, it was very tepid in the way that it talked about anti-Semitism. It was very universal. It didn't really want to deal strongly with issues such as anti-Zionism. It kind of insinuated that certain criticism of Israel can perhaps be anti-Semitic. And so these Jewish, it's kind of put this little Band-Aid on these Jewish students and their civil rights. But guess what now? Now we've got a slew of parents who are, let's say, Muslim parents who are saying, well, now, next year, we want to see anti-Semitism on Islamophobia. And of course, because you created this, right? You brought in training on anti-Semitism in order to address the rights of certain minority group. Of course, now you're going to have to address the rights of another minority group. Why do I share this? I share this as kind of a cautionary tale. The things that we bring in sometimes will have a very negative effect. The anti-Semitism training, in addition to what David said, in the sense that it universalizes, in the sense that it has a tendency to only speak about anti-Semitism on the right and very rarely, unapologetically and courageously talks of the left-wing dominant ideologies that inform today's anti-Semitism. They brush over that or really tepidly speak of it. The other thing that I want to kind of bring to everybody's attention is that this type of education that is not rooted in truth, rather rooted in, oh, this group, this minority feels that their rights have been trampled upon. Let's bring some education to make this minority group feel heard, right? Center their experience. It's natural that the next stage will be the next minority group that's going to feel hurt by this minority group. Because unless you say, look, we are going to take a stand and we're going to say that anti-Zionism really leads to, if not always is, anti-Semitism, if you're not going to deal with that, then you're going to bring training the next year on Islamophobia. And so as I'm speaking to you right now, I'm kind of trying to explain that I have evolved in my own understanding, whereas I used to be a big proponent of this type of education. And like David, I say, sure, we all need to know about anti-Semitism, but should it be these mandatory training sessions? I'm not sure, and I'm not sure what they will actually create.
Can I add one thing to this? The other problem I have with this is I think it's based on a wrongful idea of how to fight the current anti-Semitism K through 12, which it sees primarily as a pedagogical problem. In other words, if someone's teaching some bad things, we've got to teach some good things. And what I realized, I think, is that it's not primarily a pedagogical problem. It's mostly a problem involving power. A group of bad actors have captured institutions, and they're in charge, and they're dictating what kids learn in a lot of these places. If you look at what happened in Chicago when the DSA, radical socialists, took over the teachers' unions and then used that as a platform to get a very radical mayor elected and also to take over the schools, you understand that you're not going to be able to teach anti-Semitism in a very thoughtful way and do any and change anything, because that's not the problem. The problem is that a group of crazy people have taken over schools. We were just very involved recently in Parejo Valley, California. It's where there were really a couple awful school board members who scolded the Jewish community for coming to a school board meeting and questioning radical ethnic studies in schools, and a consultancy that had been teaching and promoting radical ethnic studies. And they accused the Jewish community, or these Jews that were present there, of having Jewish privilege for daring question their ideological framework. And I realized this is not going to end until those people are out of power. And if we're deluded into thinking that this is a pedagogical problem that we can fix by just by teaching good ideas and getting that school system to teach about anti-Semitism, then I think we're approaching it the wrong way.
That's a really well taken. And that actually leads me to a question that reflects questions of many people that pre-submitted to the Q&A, is basically, what can parents, educators, or Jewish organizations do to push back? Or to your point, how do we explicitly take back power in these institutions?
I have a view on taking back power. Look, there's a lot that needs to be done. I mean, we have to equip parents with the talking points. We need to help them diagnose the problem, by the way, because they may not understand that, the culturally responsive education program in their schools, or the critical literature program, or the social emotional learning program is actually a platform for this oppressed oppressor ideology that's conditioning students to think in a certain way, and that's going to inexorably lead to anti-Semitism. So first, we have to help them understand the problem. We've got to, I'm afraid to say, become a little bit like amateur philosophers here. They've got to understand what's happening in the way that Naya eloquently put it in the beginning. They have to understand these trends so that they know what their kids are being force-fed in schools. That's number one. Number two, we've got to equip them with all the tools to go out there and talk to the superintendents, talk to the teachers, and also to utilize whatever relationships they have. Maybe it's with a city council member who doesn't know what's really going on, or the member of Congress who might want to use their platform to push back against the schools. So we've got to do all that. Ultimately, they're going to have to win elections too. They're going to have to understand that if you have 5 really extreme school board members who are endorsing this and are pushing the school administration to do it, you're going to have to make change. If you have 5 school board members, or 3 of the 5, who sit there in silence as too radicals really make it worse for everybody, then you're going to have to get those people out and new people in. And that's going to take a while, but I think it's probably the only way we're going to change the power dynamic over time.
Well, I'd like to address the other part of the question, which is what about Jewish organizations? And tending to have a Russian background, everything is doom and gloom, so pardon me for that. But as a student of Jewish history, I do want to call our attention to the following, which is that Jews in the diaspora tend to gravitate towards two kind of contrasting but important modes of survival. One is universalism and the other is particularism. This is not unique to our moment right now. This is Jewish behavior that at least I've studied, and I'm not the only one, obviously, to articulate this idea. But Jews in exile, before the state of Israel was reestablished, by and large, Jews in France, in Germany, in the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire, in the United States of America, they understood that they needed to survive as a minority within a host country. And what they did in two ways. One, they would gravitate towards universalism. What does that mean? That means kind of what David was saying, where you take the story of the Holocaust and you want to make it you want people to relate to it. And so you universalize it. So you stop talking about it as a story about Jewish pain and suffering, but about, let's say, a story on intolerance. What happens about when intolerance in a society gets too out of control, right? The gravitation towards universalism is taking the Jewish particular story and kind of really universalizing it and to appeal to the dominant ideology or the dominant movement at that time. Conversely, those Jews who rejected universalism and went for particularism, they said, no, the only way to survive is to stick together, and we really kind of have to be more insular. That is going to ensure our survival. If we take these two approaches and look at how Jewish organizations now are trying to deal with anti-Semitism, you've got many Jewish organizations who are using the dominant ideology of the language of privilege, white privilege, power dynamics, oppressor and oppressed, and saying we are going to use that Jewish story and we're going to insert ourselves into the DEI framework. That's universalization. That's the mode. Unfortunately, I don't think that that is going to help, okay? Then there are the Jewish organizations who are rejecting this, who say, no, we have to teach about anti-Semitism as a unique story. Here you take people like Dara Horn, who are envisioning even looking at the Holocaust and saying, we're not even going to talk about the Holocaust, but rather we have to understand the Holocaust is part of the story of the Jewish people. It's the history of the Jewish people. And so really leaning in, if you will, into the particularism. Why I bring this up is that a lot of Jewish parents, a lot of Jewish individuals, specifically in public schools, look towards Jewish organizations to be a sort of savior. And the only thing I'm going to say here is that those Jewish organizations that are leaning towards the universalism are basically they fail to understand that the ideologies that we spoke about at the very beginning, oppressor versus oppressed, affinity groups, lived experience, this kind of language, inclusion, power dynamics, is actually priming people to become anti-Semitic. So by leaning into these ideas, they're kind of preventing from doing good work. That's what I want to say about looking towards Jewish organizations to save, to prevent the problem of anti-Semitism. Because, as I said before, this universalism may have ensured Jews their survival in the diaspora. But it also, by the way, universalism led to assimilationism, which actually was the erasure of Jewish particularism. So that's something to really consider as you, as a Jewish parent or a Jewish activist or a Jewish teacher, are thinking about, what do you want to do? How do you want to approach the problem of anti-Semitism? Do you really want to bring a group into a school that's leaning into ideologies that are priming people to become anti-Semitic?
Okay, great. I'm going to address it slightly differently than Naya, although I think we agree generally. I think major Jewish organizations are structurally restrained in a lot of ways in how they fight it. I ran some numbers. I wanted to know what the voting patterns were in places where most Jews live. So I looked at the top 10 Jewish communities in the United States, and then who do they vote for, Trump or Harris, in the last election? And as you might imagine, the 10 largest Jewish communities in every single one of those cities, they voted for Kamala Harris and not Trump, even though Trump won the election. And so what that does is it tells you a story, a larger story. That is that Jewish communities live in blue areas. We live in blue areas, and we are trying to accomplish things in blue areas very often. So if you're a local Jewish community, you may be getting security funding from your local county council or city council. And in order to curry favor to get that security funding, you're going to have to sound the right talking points in that. And if you alienate them by challenging, let's say, the DEI program in schools, you will find yourself out of favor and you will lose power in your own community. That's a tough dilemma, by the way. I mean, in some way, like there are like they also get a lot of mental health institution funding, and there are Jewish aging groups and the like, and they get government funding because that's what organizations in the social service sector do. And if they start to fight anti-Semitism in the way that I or Naya would, they may become ineffective in everything else they want to do. Now, what that tells me is that you need new organizations who are willing to fight it, and maybe let the legacy organizations continue to defend their turf, because that's important stuff as well. That's one thought. The second is, I think that it's not so much to me that we need to fight anti-Semitism as either a universal or a particular phenomena, but that we need the right universal phenomena, the right universal framework, not phenomena, but framework. And that is that, look, I believe that the reason why we're seeing an uptick in anti-Semitism is because a certain values framework, you call it American values, you call it Western values, values such as freedom of expression, values such as pluralism, e pluribus unum, from out of many come one, values such as equality of opportunity or meritocracy, values that are at the center of what it means to be a liberal society, are under assault. And as a result, anti-Semitism in that environment rises. And so for me, it's not so much about fighting against Jew hatred as a unique phenomenon, although we have to do that too, but rather fighting for those major values that are really ultimately the protection that we need in society. And so that's why we renamed our organization North American Values Institute, because we know that those are values that our society has to reclaim, that are under assault from certainly the far left and some elements in the far right as well, and that we're going to need those values restored and reinvigorated if American Jews are going to thrive. And in that way, we may be the canary in the coal mine that's often said. In other words, it's a sign of a sick society when a society turns on its Jews. And it means that the values that have protected us, liberal values, are values that are under assault right now.
I think that is absolutely key and critical. And I want to share something, because in addition to writing on anti-Semitism, I teach. And so this year I taught a course in high school for seniors on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I was thinking to myself, how do I begin this class? Right. I spent the entire summer really thinking, historically, I was thinking historically. And then I realized, well, actually, the first class really changed my entire way of approaching that, as David said, which is key, which is that anti-Semitism is that first sign, a first alarm to show that there is a decay or there is a failure in the system, in that the students that I'm teaching to have no longer believe all the values, e pluribus unum, liberal democracy, America as an outpost of freedom, democracy. These ideas not only meant nothing to these students, but these ideas posed to these students a challenge to the way that they understood the world. And so I thought to myself, actually, I need to start the class with very little on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I actually spent the first 2 months talking about value systems, right? Giving them small kind of surveys to gauge where they're at in terms of understanding where they stand on critical issues having to do with American values, and seeing, do their values align with at least what I grew up coming to this country from the former Soviet Union, as a 6-year-old, yes, I grew up here, but I grew up in this notion of, in the 90s, something known as the melting pot, right? This idea that we are all different, but we come together under a shared kind of respect and love for what makes this country great. Well, that is not the student today in America. That is not how they approach the United States of America. And so, David, I think you're absolutely right in calling our attention to the fact that perhaps the work that we should be doing is not necessarily even as an anti-Semitism, but in bringing the values back into the classroom about what makes America exceptional.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, but I have to be picky. I'm sorry, everyone. So for the Q&A, I think a lot of questions generally focus on, people just want to be pointed in a direction of what can be actionable. So I know that, David, you will have a lot of suggestions on what can be more actionable. I know Natalie put your resource for the Toolkit for Family Educators in the live chat. So if anyone's curious, please go look at that. It's just an amazing treasure trove of resources. But is there anything else that you would point someone in the direction of when they're like, okay, I clearly understand that there's a problem. I understand the diagnosis, but I just want a step that I can take?
I one time I was talking to a group of parents in the Chicago area, and I was on a panel with a woman who had been fighting back against this radical ideology in schools for a couple of years. She'd been doing this and thinking about it. And one of the parents said, "What do we do? What do we do?" And we both simultaneously said, "Do something." In other words, like what's the old saying? Don't let an imperfect voice is better than a perfect silence, I think. And I think we've got to get people just to be brave. And courage is contagious. And we've got to get parents to go out there and say, look, I want you to teach my kids how to be critical thinkers. I want you to teach them how to be good readers and writers. And good at math. I don't want you to teach them what to think, because that's not teaching critical thinking. And then I think one of the most potent talking points is, do you see what's happening to the test scores in English and in math? Did you see the national report card that came out? And why are we being distracted by teaching our kids radical ideology that there is absolutely no consensus on here? I think that's probably the most powerful talking point you can make. It's not really head on taking on the radical ideology, although I want to do that with every bone in my body, but rather making them understand that this is a true distraction from the educational mission, and the results show for it. So that's one thing I would try to bring up as a parent in almost every environment. And then, when you see as they say, when you see something, say something. When you see something and you're not sure about it, bring it to us, bring it to Naya. We'll help diagnose it for you. I might say, well, you know what, in the scheme of things, maybe that's not the biggest deal, but more often than not, we see this ideology disguised as something seemingly benign, and we're able to help you break it down and raise questions. Now, does it always work? No, it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work, but it works a lot of the time. And when you go and you intervene in the school system, when you raise questions, when you raise concerns, when you bring others involved, by the way, there's strength in numbers. So it's not just one parent, it's 5 parents going in to meet with the principal or the teacher or the superintendent of schools, you're going to be more powerful than if it's just you alone. So try to find friends. So the other thing is, try to find friends across ethnic groups. Create your own intersectionality. I used to say about brilliant parents said to me, I guess it's not really about agreeing on anti-Semitism with other groups. It's about alignment. In other words, the Chinese American parent may not be thinking a lot about anti-Semitism, but they may be thinking about how they're trying to close down the AP course or shut down the magnet school or the science school. So, okay, so let's join forces on how about a really problematic group of school board members or educators have gotten in power and are trying to make our education system worse. And let's do it with others who might come at this problem or might see it in a slightly different way. We've got to start building those coalitions.
There are lots of people who have a question of, basically, oh, there are people with all these misconceptions. How do we change their mind? And from the previous episodes of our webinar series, our other panelists have basically said, I don't. Would you agree with that assessment of, no, I don't try to change their mind or misconception about Israel or anti-Zionism? I'm just talking to a blank wall. Instead, I focus on building my movement.
Well, I guess it depends on whom you're speaking with. If I'm speaking to a student versus if I'm speaking to a board member. Now,
this would be like a board member or a DEI, professional.
Well, I think David here has much more experience on in regards to this. I don't really, that's not the space that I'm in. I'm more in education in the classroom. And that's something, by the way, I personally struggle with a lot, because what do we do if not to change minds, if not to bring them to a certain awareness? And the thing of the matter is that it takes time. It really takes time. It's not an overnight solution where you have this one conversation and you show, like, you come in and you think, oh, I'm going to show them all this data. But you have to understand, just like I came to understand with working with those students, the senior students, is that I couldn't come in with this hard data on the Arab-Israeli conflict because they have been kind of marinating in a certain framework. They were nursed on it from K through till when I saw them their senior year, on colonialism, on viewing the West as being at the center of the sin of the world. And so I wanted to affect change. I wanted to make them understand that they were, let's say, wrong. And I'm not sure if I did, to be honest with you. It takes time. And so it's something, like, personally, that I struggle with, which is, can I change people's minds? Well, I don't know. Maybe David could speak to that more. What does it mean to change somebody's mind? How long does that take? Is it a realistic even expectation?
Yeah, look, on a personal level, I'm very reluctant to write people off. I had this one experience where I was asked by a group of faculty members at an elite university who were part of a DEI, Jewish DEI affinity group, and were working with their DEI consultants to come and address the group. And I was very sure about this, so I agreed to do it. And what I found in that one instance is that the only instance I've ever seen it is you actually have the DEI consultants who are actively listening and understanding that the press, and I didn't hold back, by the way. I said the problem is not that just anti-Semitism, is that you're conditioning people to think a certain way and you're shutting down conversation, and that's what's fueling anti-Semitism. And I found them to be extremely open in the conversation, and that's why Jewish faculty who were involved thought it would be productive conversation. Now, do I believe that can work at scale? And the answer is no. In other words, at scale, I'm going to spend time talking to people who are already primed to agree to me and get them to be more active. There are people on the fence on these issues. You can find a school board and you can see these dynamics play out, where you can see the pain on the face of a school board member who you get the sense knows that a lot of this is just over the top, but doesn't want to be called out or doesn't want to lose the next election or be primaried or whatever. And that person may be convincible, and you should absolutely, cultivate some courage in that person if you can. But if you think about this as like a set of concentric circles with your core, and then the core being the people who are already inclined to agree with you but don't know what to do, and then the one circle out being that school board member who secretly thinks something's wrong but doesn't want to fight, versus then the person, the radical or whatever. You're going to start with your core. Spend most of your time in the core, because we haven't gotten our core fully mobilized yet. And I think we've got to do a lot of work in our core and help the core go out to that next level of the concentric circle and be influential there.
Mm. Yeah, that's really helpful.
But I'll tell you, Susanna, can somebody change my mind? And I have to tell you, they can't on these things. They really won't be able to. On certain things, I'm very intractable. Like when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that, I think people talked about having a fixed mindset versus a more, a mindset that's more bendable. Right, there's a lot that goes into what can change somebody's mind, but I have a certain value system that I also was nursed in, that I also grew up, that nursed me rather. And this question, can we change people's minds, is again something I struggle with all the time, because I want to change their minds, but I have to understand that it's not just facts that will change them, it's a value system. And I have a value system as well, right?
Yeah, I think it takes a little bit of discernment to understand if you're speaking to a true believer or someone who can be amenable or is just trying to save face, etc. So thank you for your input on that. And we are coming up against the top of the hour. We're already a little bit past. So I want to say thank you once again to our speakers, Dr. Naya Lekht and David Bernstein. Thank you for sharing your insight. And I wanted to give you guys the opportunity. Please plug your work. If someone is interested in learning more about you and what you do, where can they find you or follow you?
You can find us at navivalues.org. That's NAVI values.org. They can also find me on Twitter at David L Bernstein, and would love to if anybody wants to reach out to me, you can do it. I'm David at navivalues.org. Happy to talk.
Well, I'm pretty active on social media, but I write mostly. I write for JNS, I write for Allgemeiner and Jewish Journal. So you could find my writings there. I've also started a podcast called Don't Know Much About, which is short segments on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, but also taking on other topics such as the origins, let's say, of DI. And that's something that I recently started my initiative with this podcast.
Great.
So,
My podcast is called The Contrarian. So you can find that on your podcast app.
Very aptly named.
I am very contrarian.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So thank you everyone for joining us today. This session was part of our 6-part series. And so our plan is that we're going to have a little bit of a summer break. And then when the school session begins again in the, late August, early September, we're going to begin again with our latter 3 sessions. So for those of you who are more interested in what is very tangible, we're going to be doing a deep dive on anti-Semitism in teaching colleges and teachers' unions, as well as a deep dive with people whose bread and butter is the fight back. If you want more information about actions, tune in for that session, as well as our final session is gonna, actually David will be joining us again, focused on something he touched on, which is building bridges, building broad coalitions across whole groups of, ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, etc., about this broader issue of, really ensuring the academic rigor of our children. And if you value discussions like these, you can help us continue them. Right now, the AHA Foundation is running a spring match campaign. So that means that if we were able to raise $25,000 in matching funds, we get to unlock another $25,000 to help us continue work like this. So if you're interested in supporting this campaign where you can double your impact, please go to the ahafoundation.org/donate. And Natalie actually put a link in the chat. Thank you, Natalie. And that's a great way to make a bigger impact. So we hope to see you at our next sessions. Thank you again for being part of this session. This was our most highly attended so far live, and you can catch a recording later. So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.